Hi, thank you for joining us. This is our last talk of the Game Development Crisis Conference, so I hope you're excited. The talk is going to be on inclusive LiveOps by Justin Gwertzman, the General Manager of PlayFab.
Super honored to speak with you today. The theme of today's conference was games in crisis or development in crisis. And, I've chosen to focus on sort of a more positive aspect of crisis, namely, we have the ability to change things when you're in a crisis and rethink sort of how things are done. So I've been the general manager of PlayFab now since founding it almost 6 years ago. We were acquired by Microsoft about 2 years ago. And I've had a chance at Microsoft to sort of grow the business and think a lot about what it means to do live ops. And for those of you who don't know PlayFab, we do backend services for games. A lot of how those services are used is helping games with their live ops post-launch, sort of all the things you do once your game goes live to sort of grow and manage your audience. And one of the big things we often think about is, so we're just rather in the last sort of few months, we've started exploring a new topic called inclusive live ops. And so I wanted to use this conference and this talk as a chance to try out some new ideas and present some material that frankly we've never presented before. So this is the first time anyone is seeing a lot of this material. Super excited to share it with you today and would love to frankly get your feedback and thoughts on it. So I've included my email address here. You're welcome to give me feedback afterwards, or we have some time at the end for Q&A to also hear your thoughts and frankly add to this dialogue, because I think the idea of inclusive games and inclusive live ops are new ideas that we're just now starting to develop. So we're going to start by sort of jumping off point of just acknowledging just how big gaming has gotten, right? We're up to now, we believe, 2.6 billion people on the planet playing games. To be fair, a lot of these are playing games on mobile phones because that's the device they have. But nonetheless, that's an enormous audience. And it's such a large audience that you'd think finding an audience for your game should be easy, right? With that many players out there, finding an audience for your own game should be really straightforward. But of course, in practice, it's not that easy. When we go out and talk to game developers, far and away, the number one concern I hear from people is, how am I going to find players for my game, right? And so why is that hard? Why is it so hard to get such an audience? Well, a bunch of reasons. One is, as games have become services and have become communities, they become incredibly sticky, right? A lot of players jump into a game and are in there every day playing and developing that game as a service. It's no longer, buy and download a game, 12 hours later, you've completed all the content and you're done. Games are now these living, breathing online services. So, just looking at some stats in the last couple of years, 90% of the top 10 games in 2017 were still in the top 10 in 2018. In fact, only one game, Fortnite, managed to claw its way to the top. And that's super scary if you're trying to build an audience, because with such popularity at the top of the charts, how can you break in? Plus, these games often have the budgets to be able to drive up the cost of acquisition and sort of keep that audience for themselves. Another factor is when games are put on a phone, other sources of entertainment are just one click away. And so if you're playing a game and you get a push notification or pop-up, it might be from another game, or it might be from TikTok or HBO Now. And so you've got other source of entertainment super easily competing for attention. So that's a concern. And of course, we have you're in this unique kind of golden age of gaming where tools like Unity and Unreal have really democratized development. We're at the point now where we have thousands of games coming out every month, if not more. And we have new platforms like Roblox that I'm especially fascinated by. I've been watching my 7-year-old really go deep in Roblox over the last few months as part of the self-quarantine here at home. And these are game platforms. Roblox is not a toy. This is a real serious platform. There are games on there whose audiences are bigger than some of the top games on iOS and Android. So these are real platforms. And so with this flood of content, even more challenging for how your game is going to send out, right? So with all this as a backdrop, that sort of takes us to this theme of inclusive live ops. And so Microsoft has a group called Gaming for Everyone. And I've had the privilege to work closely with them over the last few months, which has been super inspiring. And much of the content that I'm about to share was inspired by and created in collaboration with our Gaming for Everyone group. And so if you've heard of Gaming for Everyone in the past, it's probably in the context of this. This is our Xbox adaptive controller, super inspiring device. It was created to help gamers of all shapes and sizes and abilities play games. If you haven't seen the video for this, you should grab a box of Kleenex and watch the video. Yeah, it's super inspiring and the kind of thing that will make you proud to create games and proud to be part of the game community. Certainly makes me proud to work at Microsoft and be part of this bigger effort. But the work that the G4E or Gaming for Everyone group does goes beyond just accessibility. And in particular, we've been starting to think about this notion of inclusive games that invite a larger audience by design. And one of the kind of ideas is, if you're trying to invite a larger audience, that doesn't mean you have to be bland, right? That's not saying you have to pander or create a game that's going to have universal appeal to every one of those 2.8 billion gamers, because frankly, that's obviously impossible. So we're not saying that you should, restrict your audience. We're also not saying, you should have edge. You should have style. You should have a point of view and an opinion and an art style, and you should really have build the game you want to build. But then once you've drawn that box, once you've figured out what your game is, don't leave anyone out that would otherwise be a potential player for your game. And there's a quote that our Game for Everyone team uses all the time, which I love, which is, if you do not intentionally, deliberately, and proactively include, you will unintentionally exclude. And I think a lot of times we as game developers unintentionally exclude players from our games that would otherwise be very, very enthusiastic. And so as I've been thinking about sort of what the next sort of frontier of LiveOps is, we've come up with this term of inclusive LiveOps. And the idea that as you're continually engaging your players, as you're doing continuous updates, as you're doing analytics, as you're running live events, as you're doing all the things we do around LiveOps, how do we do it in such a way that we're being inclusive and are really trying to include the broadest possible audience, taking into account things like accessibility, globalization, approachability, and even representation of players. So different kind of themes you might look at for this. And so I'm going to give a shameless plug here for a second. There's a podcast that one of my colleagues, Kristen Cox, and I produce called The Art of LiveOps. And if you haven't listened to it, of course, I'd love if you did. It's out there and it's on all the, anywhere you get your podcast from, you should be able to find it. And one of the themes, so every week that we broadcast this, we talk to a different person involved in LiveOps about just this new field of art and discipline in the game space. And one of the themes that we've been really exploring a lot over the course of our first season, and now that we're starting to record season 2 for this, is this notion that LiveOps really requires a player-first mentality. The way you design and build your games now is really changing. It's no longer so much about being sort of like a movie director with a very strong opinion and point of view that you're trying to communicate to your players. You can have that, but it's almost more like being a nightclub impresario or a cruise ship director, in the sense that you're creating an experience where your players are an intimate part of it with you, and you're really taking a player-first approach to design, where you're putting the player at the center of the experience and figuring out what they're going to need to be successful. And this notion of player-first design is not only great for LiveOps, it's really at the heart of inclusivity, which is how do you make sure you're including the broadest possible audience for your game. And so what I want to do now is share, just a handful of sort of techniques that we have seen be effective for inclusive LiveOps, and then, kind of talk about where that might take the industry in the future, and hopefully open it up then for a dialogue and discussion about where else we can go with this. And so I think the first thing is, inclusive LiveOps does start with analytics, and it starts by understanding your audience, because if you don't understand who you're reaching, you're not going to be able to adjust for it. And so it might be understanding countries, so understanding which countries you're reaching. I think a lot of game developers by default just go after North America or maybe Europe or certain other countries they're familiar with, but there's obviously a lot of world out there. And so thinking about globalization is a key way to expand your audience and to expand the footprint of your potential, traffic. And measuring, of course, is one of the ways to do that. Also measuring when you can, when your platform allows you, things like gender. And so if you're connected with Facebook Connect, you can get gender information. It's a way of understanding if you're inadvertently leaving players out. You might not be choosing to. So we think analytics is kind of a foundation of just understanding sort of where you are baselining, so that then as you go forward, you can start to measure impacts of changes and how that might affect your game and its potential audience. Another one is continuous experimentation. So this is another one of kind of core benchmarks of LiveOps is this idea that you're continually trying new things. You're continually experimenting. They can be formalized A/B tests where you're actually running like a multivariate experiment with your saying, okay, I'm not sure in my tutorial, for example, which is going to be most effective. So you might run 5 different variants at the same time and measure for them. There's a lot of good technique about there, how to do those kinds of experiments. Or it can simply be every time you run a live event, you look at how it affects your numbers, and over time you start to get a feel for what works and what doesn't work for your community. And it will start to skew and shift your design as you start to look at the data and see what's actually working. And so one of our kind of second points of inclusive LiveOps is actively running experiments to reduce that player friction. When we think about inclusivity, we think a lot about both on-ramps and off-ramps. So an on-ramp is sort of how does a player get into your game and how do you build that audience in the first place? An off-ramp would be something that makes your player want to leave your game. Kind of one of the aspects of inclusive LiveOps is to explicitly look at how you reduce friction for new players coming into your game. And you can do that with explicit A/B tests, where you're trying 5 different variations of a tutorial and looking at which variation is most effective. But you can also simply make a change and then see how it affects your numbers, and then kind of go from there. And the most successful games that have the widest audiences are doing this on a continual basis, not just during soft launch, not just in the first few days after they get their game out there, but even a year in, there are still maybe ways to improve your first time experience and to avoid losing players who might otherwise be great fans of your game. So moving on, then we're talking about globalization and accessibility, and ways we can take advantage of new technologies to help broaden the audience. So in particular, for example, our Azure Cognitive Services group has technologies that do both real-time speech-to-text and text-to-speech translation, as well as real-time language translation. And we've taken these technologies and folded them into the PlayFab Party system, which is our voice chat system, so that for games who wish to have real-time captioning to help with those with disabilities, or if they want to have real-time language translation, so I can, for example, speak in French and you'll see it in say, Russian, or vice versa, we provide that as well. And these are, again, techniques for broadening the audience for your game. Another one is moderation. So obviously I was speaking earlier about both on-ramps and off-ramps, and saying that in any game, there are the on-ramps that make it easy for a player to come into your game, but there are also often off-ramps. And you, as a designer, want to think about both intentional off-ramps and unintentional off-ramps. So if I'm in a game and I'm being harassed, or I'm feeling like there's other toxic players who are really making it very unpleasant for me to want to play the game, I might just quit because I just don't want to take it anymore. And that would be an unintentional off-ramp you don't want. And so one of the things you can think about is how do you provide intentional off-ramps to help players opt out of experiences that they don't want without having to quit out of your game entirely. And so in particular, we partner with a company called 2hat, which provides software called Community Sift, which does a really nice job of helping look for toxic behavior among your players. And then once you've identified that behavior, you can do things like you can segregate all of your toxic players onto their own server. You can flag those players for review by an admin and potentially ban them from your community. You can flag their content and make sure that players below a certain age are not being exposed to content. There's a lot of things you can do with it. But in particular, just we especially the Xbox Live service, we also partner. We use 2hat as part of our Xbox Live, and that's a key part of making sure that we maintain a safe community in Xbox Live, which is part of the value, and that's part of why we think players want to be with us, is that guarantee of safety. Another thing is to think about your difficulty curves. And so one of the things that can be a real friction for players is if the game's too hard. And obviously for every player, actually either too hard or too easy. So you really want to find the sweet spot. And this is especially important with casual games. In the case of multiplayer games, other players' skill and skill matching is a little bit more of the issue. You're really about doing efficient matchmaking to make sure the players of the same skill are playing against each other. That's a separate topic that you also want to pay attention to. But in this case, I'm talking more about those single-player experiences, which is how do you tune those difficulty curves. And there's actually some great, I saw some material out there from King.com at a conference talking about how they were using machine learning and AI to, in particular, do extensive testing to try and tune difficulty curves to unique players. So if you're a player and it's too easy, they're gonna make it harder. If it's too hard, you're gonna make it easier. And you can do that as a one-off segmentation or a continual process. Because again, trying to maintain the optimal flow is what's going to really keep that broadest possible audience for your game and help with that inclusivity. And then finally, this one more kind of point is thinking about crossplay and thinking about if you're going to have a multiplayer game, which itself, frankly, multiplayer games alone already have a lot of barriers to a lot of players, whether it's latency or performance or the harassment issue we talked about earlier. If you're going to have multiplayer games, thinking about enabling crossplay between the different communities so that, for example, if I'm on iOS, I can play against players on Android or even on an Xbox or a PlayStation. That sort of crossplay is going to, again, open up your play group and provide the most possible liquidity for your players. And so if I'm trying to find a match, why add the friction of only limiting them to the group that they're part of? Why not open up to the whole community? So that's what I got today. Those are some examples that we have used and seen internally here at Microsoft in our own group when we think about being inclusive. What I want to do now, and I know we got to content pretty quick, what I really want to do now is open it up and frankly have more of a dialogue and a discussion to understand where we think other game developers and where are you thinking about how you are being inclusive, either with your LiveOps in particular, the post-launch period, or frankly, if you're thinking about even during your initial design process and your game creation, where you're thinking about how your game can be inclusive and not restrict sort of who's in there and playing. And so I would love to hear your thoughts on that. I'm going to turn off my presentation. So that's my email. And if you're shy and don't want to say it in public, you can email me privately. I'd love to hear your thoughts and have a dialogue offline. But I'd also would love to end this and then see what people have to share. Okay. Are we live?
Sorry. Yes. Thank you so much. We are live, and we do have questions from the audience.
Okay.
We have a question that is, an earlier panel talked about community design to create positive experiences. How can LiveOps support intentional community design?
Right, that's a good question. So we absolutely think games are communities now. And we very much look at game as communities, one of the key kind of big trends. And community is more than just a bunch of players killing each other in a multiplayer game. Community really is, I totally agree, it's about being intentional. I think there's a bunch of practices in LiveOps that lead to communities. One of them is UGC and allowing players to create their own content as part of personalizing their experience and also sharing their own content with others. And so especially when it comes to representation, if you've created a certain type of content for your game, and maybe you've unintentionally not been fully representational about all your players, by allowing UGC, you may find that members of your community create their own content and upload it that helps widen the diversity of what you're including in your game. And so so we encourage games to think about UGC as one aspect of their community design. Another one is when it comes to running your live events. And so another thing that really brings the community together are the kinds of events you run. So if you're running events like, I don't know, fishing tournaments, that might be a solo tournament where players are out there fishing to try to catch as many fish as they can in a 24-hour period. Whoever catches most fish wins a prize. That's a great event. It's not necessarily a group event. And we've seen some non-traditional events, like a lot of MMOs in particular would have events like, goofy events like screenshot capture contests, where they would encourage people to take a screenshot of themselves, or they would publish a screenshot and invite people to caption it and then post the captions for voting. Those kinds of events really do create more of a community sense. Sometimes the thing that bonds your community together can actually be a mistake, and that can actually be a lot of fun. So one of the scenarios that Ralph Koster talked about in one of the episodes of our podcast is he talked about how they ran a Christmas event at Ultima Online, and they put a Santa Claus in every town, but they forgot to say that you couldn't steal the clothing off of Santa Claus. And so what happened is very quickly, players were figuring this out, and they were running up and stealing all the clothing from Santa Claus. And so that had two things. One is you'd come to these towns, there'd be these big fat naked men, yelling ho 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 at you, which was sort of off-putting. But then also they had these bands of thieves hiding out in the forests, jumping on you to steal your stuff, dressed up like Santa Claus. And so, that was unintentional and maybe not the best player experience, but it absolutely created sort of a shared community bond for players. And so there's just a handful of ideas there that I think can help. For sure, yeah, and I know a lot of games have avatar designers that try to push the envelope in terms of how wide that can go. One of the things we did at Microsoft recently that the G3 team pioneered is simply the act of including, for example, a wheelchair for your avatar. And trying to trying to allow players to go even wider afield in terms of what's going to best personalize them. Yeah, those things can absolutely be both great, but also can be a lot of unintentional barriers you put up in terms of how a player identifies themselves.
Yeah, definitely. So we have another question for the audience. They ask if you have any thoughts or tips for teams still trying to figure out how to work remotely when it comes to adopting a LiveOps mentality.
Yeah, so obviously remote work is challenging for everyone. We've been one of the things that we've been focusing a lot on. Frankly, one topic we thought about for this presentation was how to move your content production pipeline to the cloud. Is something we spent a lot of time with our first-party studios, because I think a lot of teams are moving production pipelines to the cloud so that they can be accessed from anywhere in the world. This is especially important for LiveOps, because the thing with a LiveOps is, especially take a live event, right? So probably the two most basic parts of a LiveOps strategy is, number one, content updates and the ability to make changes to your game. And then number two, live events, where you're running a limited time only event or some sort of special activity for a limited time only. In both those cases, the time span between when you have the design idea and you put it live in your game, may be a matter of a couple of days. And so you don't have when you're building your game, you might take months to get game content to your pipeline and tune it perfectly and get it out there. With a live event, especially if the live event is responding to something happening live in the world, for example, like, I don't know, stay-home COVID event or something, you just don't have the same sort of time frames. And so, moving your production pipeline to the cloud, make it easy to, for example, tune all of your configuration data from the server, so you don't have to update your game client to activate the changes. These are the kinds of things you want to have thought about ahead of time, so that when it does come time to roll out your event, you can do it easily. And they'll have the side benefit of making it much easier to do from home. So if your game developers in your studio are all working from home, the ability to log in and make changes off the back end versus having to go through sort of complicated on-prem type solutions is really going to help.
So you mentioned having difficulty curves that are carefully studied or use AI to help generate them. Is there any advantage to you doing sort of A/B testing when it comes to difficulty curves and changes with a live production audience?
It depends on the kind of curves you're making. We definitely see some kinds of A/B tests are easier to run than others. For example, let's say you decide to A/B test pricing of items in your store. Okay, that can backfire, right? Because obviously, if one player says, "Hey, I bought this item for $1.99," and someone else bought the exact same item for $2.99, and there's nothing else that differentiates them, that might, for example, cause concerns. On the other hand, if you are what we find, for example, doesn't raise as much concern is choosing which items to show a player. So a player logs in the store and they see one set of items, a different player logs on, and by default they're seeing a different set of items. As long as the items are consistently priced, seeing a different set of items can be no problem, and it doesn't raise the same flags. And so that's an example of the kind of A/B test that's going to be easier to run. If that makes sense.
No, yeah, definitely. I can see how it wouldn't upset the community as much. And I noticed in one of the games that I've been playing recently, what they've been doing is they've been doing sales for everyone, but only for 24 hours. And they don't advertise those sales, but definitely you can tell that they're experimenting with the sales numbers to get a good feeling of what works best for their community.
Totally. And that's a great example. So a limited time offer, where that limited time offer is personalized to the player, that's good, not just because different players are obviously going to respond and want to see different kinds of offers. A brand new player who's only played your game for 24 hours will respond very differently to one type of offer than a player who's level 80 and been in there for months. And so you should be personalizing your offers. And the act of choosing what offer to show someone, that's a perfect opportunity to A/B test different algorithms or heuristics to see what's gonna work. And again, this is not just about I think one of the things that gave some aspects of LiveOps got a bad rep early on because they were seen as exercises in maximizing, for example, monetization. And I'm going to try to squeeze every dollar out of my players I can. I would say for the most successful developers we speak with, that is not how they think about it at all. What they're optimizing for is not monetization. They're optimizing for engagement. And how do I engage my players as long and as deeply as I can, trusting if they do that, then the money will follow, especially in a free-to-play game. And so that really fits nicely with this notion of inclusive LiveOps, the idea that you're trying to really focus on reducing friction, reducing barriers, maximizing engagement, keeping your players as happy and engaged as they can. And things like offers are part of that. And giving someone unique content that fitted for where they are in the game loop or where they are in their cycle is key. So if you've got, for example, here's a real scenario. If you have a game that depends on leveling up, and you've got a player who sort of came in a given cohort and they're sort of behind their cohort, they've sort of fallen behind, they're not leveling up as fast as the rest of their cohort, and they're potentially going to get left behind. That might be an opportunity for a unique offer to them to kind of bring them back into spec. So, hey, here's an offer, here's a unique item that is a 50% off that will help boost your XP to the point where you're kind of back into the leveling curve with the rest of your cohort. And that can actually both increase that player's enjoyment and also kind of keep that multiplayer liquidity up as well.
Great. So, as you're looking to maximize engagement, clearly, time in game is an engagement number, but what are some other important values to look at to really judge if your players are engaging more?
Yeah. So that depends on the kind of game. Not every game, hours in game is just not going to be as relevant, for example, to an idle clicker game as, a hardcore, MOBA game or something like this. So obviously it's going to depend. I think we see games like idle clicker games, for example, are probably going to look a lot more at issues like number of sessions per day, where the length of session that matters a lot less than the number of sessions. Or they might be looking at factors like choosing to engage with a certain game mechanic. So if you've added, let's say, a card playing mechanic to your game, what percentage of players are choosing to engage with that mechanic, if it's optional, would be another measure of engagement. And this is where one of the things that we see successful game developers doing with their analytics systems is they use their analytics system like a time machine. And I sort of especially love this idea of using your data to be able to go back in time to see how players differ from each other when they first engage with your game. So what do I mean by that? What you can do is you can take two different groups of players. Let's say one group of players, the players who made it all the way to level 30, let's just say. And so you're going to take an arbitrary slice and say, okay, the level 30 players are deeply engaged in the game. They love the game. Let's take that group on one hand. Every player who got to level 30 or beyond. And then on the other hand, take another group of players who did not engage. Let's say these are players who dropped out after level 5. So every player who made it through level 1 through 4, but never made it to level 5, right? And take that group of players. And then what you do is you take those players and you sort of go back in time to when all those players were at level 1 and what those players were doing for their first, let's say, 24 hours of gameplay. And asking yourself, like, what's the difference? And can you predict from just the first 24 hours of gameplay what's going to lead the player to become a level 30 player and what's going to lead a player to drop out after level 5? And you may, maybe it won't be fruitful, but maybe you'll find out that, oh, okay, turns out that players who, earn their first achievement in the first 3 hours, or players who, level up within the first 2 hours, those players are way more likely to go on to level 30 than the players who drop out. Now, look, it's hard to tell cause and effect sometimes, and it could be that this is not the cause, but it's worth exploring that. And you may say, okay, I now have a hypothesis. My hypothesis is players who level up within the first couple hours are way more likely to stay engaged than players who don't. And then you can look at your data and say, well, why aren't players leveling up? Maybe they're not leveling because it's too hard. Maybe my game is just too difficult. So maybe I'm losing players. It's that unintentional off-ramp where I'm losing players because of the difficulty. Or maybe it is because there's a random event in the game where some players just randomly get a certain item and they make it, and some don't, and they end up dropping out. And that item becomes so critical that it's not good to keep that random. Actually, you want to make it deterministic and make sure you always get that item at a certain point in the game, because that's what's going to determine your success. And then you can try, based on those hypotheses, running the experiments. So you say, great, now I'm going to do an A/B test. I'm going to take half of my I'm going to create a new cohort of brand new players and create an A/B test where only those new players are going to have 2 different paths. Half of them will get the original path, and half of them are going to get the new variant. Maybe it's that non-deterministic item, maybe it's a different difficulty curve or something. And then I'm going to see if that has an effect and makes those players more likely to continue on to level 30 than before. And if they are, then you can say, okay, that really was a cause and not an effect, and I'm going to actually make that change now for everyone. And I'm going to kind of bake that change into my core game design. And that's the kind of continuous what-if scenario running that successful games do, who are looking to reduce their friction, reduce their curves, and sort of focus on maximizing engagement.
That's great. So you're doing sort of an observation, make a hypothesis, and then test it out, and then make that change permanent if it concludes that there really is a beneficial change there.
Yep, exactly.
Great. Those iteration loops, are so important to game development. So when
go ahead. I was going to say, and we do this all the time, here at Microsoft, not just inside of our games, but even on our platform. So, the Xbox itself or Game Pass itself, we're doing these kinds of experiments to try to make changes that are going to hopefully, make it more likely that someone will stick around or use the service or what have you. And of course, we have whole usability teams that do this kind of work. But anyone can do, this kind of the wonder of analytics now is that you no longer have to do specialized, mirrored room, type expensive user tests. Just watching players as they play the game, if you have the right telemetry in place, gives you enough raw data to go through and sift it later and try to find those patterns, which is super cool.
So speaking of watching players play the game via their inputs, what sort of inputs do you recommend looking at and tracking? Like, do you want to see every place they touched on the screen ever, or there's some really critical points of engagement that help give better insight?
Yeah, good point. And obviously, the more telemetry you gather, the more expensive it is to do that. And we have games at Microsoft who are, frankly, kind of almost obsessive. Like, for example, our Forza team, I think at peak, they were doing something like a 500,000 or a million events per second being logged from across their players. And that may be appropriate depending on what you're trying to look for, but most games you can't afford that, and that's frankly not that's overkill. What you're really looking for is the key events. Leveling up, depending on your gameplay, it might be leveling up, dying, making purchases. You're looking for those moments of peak engagement, right? And those are the things you want to be for sure capturing. And then in addition, you want to look at the key choices players are making. When they go, especially if your game is a free-to-play loop, when they enter a store, that's an event you care about, because you then care about, do they buy something or not? And so knowing entering a store but not purchasing is just as important as entering a store and purchasing. Or you might have, for example, entering a store and clicking an item and then not purchasing. So then just clicking an item might be something you want to look at versus the purchase event, which is often the different event to track. Things that really represent choices players are making is where it's going to matter. You don't need to be tracking every little activity players do, because it generates a ton of telemetry. And frankly, most games developers won't ever go back and look at that data. That's almost overkill. Now, look, if you can afford it, great. One thing we do counsel teams to do is to gather as much data as they can, because you never quite know what question your designers are going to have. And it sucks to have a question and realize you don't have enough data to answer that question.
Yeah, better too much data than too little, as long as you have enough place to store it, right?
Exactly right, as long as you can afford it. And the good news is storage is pretty cheap these days. So, again, we're not trying to toot our own horn. There's a lot of solutions out there. Our solution has both our analytics solution has both an express lane and a normal kind of the local lane, I guess. And the express lane is actually super cheap to store data. So you can send us telemetry events, and it's way cheaper than the other path. The other path is nice because you can not just store data, but you can actually inspect every event as it comes through and make real-time choices based on it. So you can do things like adding rules and actions, like if the player clicks on an item and doesn't buy it, I'm actually going to trigger a rule to maybe send them a message saying, hey, do you sure you don't want to buy that item or something? And that could be an experiment you run later, versus the express lane where that just goes straight to disk, and then you have to do your own kind of offline analysis later to analyze that and choose what to do about it. but that's fine. It's there's a lot of systems out there, and they all have different mechanisms for analytics.
So one of our viewers asked, do you have any stories about where over-engagement led to burnout and how you detected it?
Yeah, so we hear about this typically in sort of the mobile casual space in particular, right? Where I think a lot early on, there was sort of what you'll often see is a game come out with a new system, and there's a rush to go and clone that system. And I think early on, this is really done, I would say, very artlessly. And so a good example would be you might decide, okay, I want a player to log into my game every day, right? Well, there's a couple ways to do that. And the most brute force is I'm going to create a game mechanic where, every day you log in, as long as it's a streak, you get a prize, and so I'm literally going to pay you for logging in every day to my game. If you do that so that it is dressed up well and it fits within the fiction of the game, then it can actually be really effective, right? So for example, a game where you have to collect your crops or else they rot, well, that's an incentive to log in because I don't want my crops to rot, Or in a game like Animal Crossing, I don't want to see dust, cobwebs and cockroaches in my house. So those are sort of motivations for players to feel very natural and fit within the spirit of the game that feel okay. Whereas literally just like saying, this is the daily retention system where it's like every time you log in, it's like checking off the box in a calendar, and there's no reason to do it except to basically earn your reward for logging in. That's the kind of thing that can lead to over engaging and start to get that kind of feeling of burnout, where you start to feel like, hey, wait a minute, this is like a giant, I'm just a rat in an experiment here, being manipulated. And you never want players to feel that way. And frankly, that's the wrong attitude as a developer. I think you don't want to have the attitude of, what behaviors can I play with to try to change my player motivations. You want to be asking, like, what's going to be most fun for my players, and do that. Another thing is about over engaging is we often see when you're creating your live event schedule, some events are way heavier duty than other events, right? I might have a 48-hour live event, which is new content, and the first 10 players that finish the content are going to get a prize. Okay, that is a very intense event because you're basically telling your players to drop everything they're doing for the entire weekend and kick, and not sleep to achieve that content first. So it might seem like a good idea to you, but man, you're asking your players to go through a lot to get that prize, and they will. But you have to be very careful not to do that kind of event too often. That might be something you do once a month or once every few months. You can't do that kind of event every weekend. On the other hand, you might have a lighter weight event where, for example, you have content, but there's no time limit. Like, here's some new content, and anyone who finishes it, or be very generous. As long as you finish this new content within 72 hours, everyone gets a prize. There's no race. That's a way lighter weight event. That's going to be way more okay on players. And then you might think of even lighter weight events, like just simply saying, okay, it's Thursday, so we're having a sale, or it's unique content on sale for Valentine's Day. One of the traditional, very classic events where they're like the lowest touch events, but they still have player reward in terms of unique content and engagement.
So you were talking a lot about events where an individual was participating to win for themselves. Have you found any success with games that are using events where it's about the entire community working together towards a goal so everyone gets rewarded?
Absolutely, and love those. We call this kind of Groupon events, right? Where it's sort of like this notion of you're all in it together, and if everyone can achieve something, then the whole village gets a new well or something. I don't know. It depends on your game. But no, absolutely. And I think, again, the best games mix and match their events, and they really play with it. So it's not always the same style. You have competitive events, you have cooperative events, you have solo events, you have group events, you have commerce events, you have content events, you have cross-marketing events. I actually gave a talk at GDC a couple years back that's probably in the vault somewhere, specifically on sort of a catalog of all possible events we've seen out in the wild. And it's just fun to just look at the sheer variety of events people come up with. And it's actually one of the areas of creativity in LiveOps that I kind of love the most, is just seeing the kind of cool events people come up with. Well, so I worked at PopCap for 8 years, and so my taste, I have to confess, my tastes run more toward casual than hardcore. And I just find myself playing more games on mobile these days, just because that's I'm older now, in my 40s, and the only time I ever seem to have is those little bite-sized chunks of time. So I tend to play games that fit well within little bite-sized units. I no longer have the luxury of setting aside 3 or 4 hours to really go deep and wallow in something. Although that said, I do a lot of secondhand gaming. So for example, I've got a 7-year-old, and we do a lot of Switch gaming together. So I have completed like Mario Galaxy, and I have gone through and done. She's playing a lot of Animal Crossing now, and I've spent a lot of time with her, like over her shoulder, as it were, over the shoulder gaming, as opposed to playing myself. So but me personally, from designing for myself, it would be mobile, and it would be more of a casual game. Although the one game I'm actually playing right now that I'm really enjoying a lot, I'm actually playing The Room VR, because I love The Room and The Room series of mobile games, and I've been and we have the new index, and so I've been playing both Alex and The Room VR to sort of but that's exactly the kind of deep immersive gaming I rarely have time for.
That's great. I love those kinds of games. So speaking of children playing games, have you found that age ranges really change how people interact with games? And what sort of things would you be looking for when trying to optimize a game to work best for kids versus adults?
Yeah, again, it goes back to inclusivity, right? Who are you trying to invite into your game? Roblox is interesting. So I am, like I mentioned earlier, I've been spending a lot of time, watching a lot of Roblox being played. And what's neat about Roblox is you're seeing games in Roblox adopting all the LiveOps techniques of traditional games just inside of Roblox. And so they have events, they have limited time offers, they have leaderboards, they have content presentation. They're continually updating and changing the content based on what their player community tells them. So they're doing and because of the expectations for production quality are perhaps lower, they're able to do all this a lot faster. The iteration loop is really sped up because there's just less expectations. And I don't know. I'm maybe going to embarrass myself here. I don't know that there's necessarily that much of a difference between what younger kids want versus what adults want. Expectations might be a little different. Sophistication in storytelling might be a little bit different. But in terms of gameplay, again, back at PopCap, I was there for the launch of Plants vs. Zombies. And I was in charge I was working for PopCap China at the time and rolling out Plants vs. Zombies across Asia. And that's a game that is like a truly universal appeal game. I mean, for kids, adults, teenagers, everyone was playing Plants vs. Zombies and loving it. And that is a game that kind of made me realize there really isn't necessarily a big gap as long as the core gameplay loop is tight.
Great, that makes tons of sense. And speaking of which, one of our viewers asked, have you seen any effective family games where they are built for parents and children to play together?
Not enough, and that's an area where I think Nintendo does a really good job, right? So I already mentioned, Mario Galaxy, and I love the fact that you can play that solo or 2-player co-op. And I think the co-op games are the best because when you can, let one player take one set of controls almost, and help the other player through the game. And one of the, I mentioned the Xbox adaptive controller earlier. One of the things that's neat about the adaptive controller is virtually any button or set of buttons can be sort of remoted and used by a second player. And so, if a player can only push a button, then you can basically say, great, your job is to push the A button. I'll do everything else. And you can sort of take one joystick and almost split one joystick across 2 players. And I don't think we do enough of that. I actually think that's an example going back to inclusivity in gaming. I think any game could do that, and you don't have to have the expensive adaptive controller for that. You can do it with just regular controllers. So saying, all right, virtualize my joystick so player A is doing movement and player B is shooting, for example. Why don't more games do that? Because that would allow a parent to play a game with a kid and say, you're in charge of shooting, I'm going to do a little running around. And that would make it much easier to cooperate. Difficulty, we talked about difficulty curves. I actually think a lot of games get around difficulty curves by having like easy, medium, or like impossible, right? Even easy is often still too hard for a lot of younger gamers. And my wife actually is an occupational therapist, and we recently got she was working as an occupational therapist in a school for kids with special needs, and she got a grant from Child's Play to bring in a bunch of game equipment as part of the occupational therapy practice there. And she was finding even the easy level, the games are still too hard for a lot of these kids. And she's like, why isn't there like a super easy mode where it's like, ridiculous easy, but that still might be the right level of challenge for someone. And so I think, again, going back to inclusivity, thinking about these sort of wider variations of difficulty can be often what it takes to bring a more inclusive group in.
Right, that makes sense. Having the God mode of the older games and turning off deaths and things.
Well, it's why I go back to Minecraft. I mean, my kid, my 7-year-old, never wants to play Minecraft in what's called zombie mode, adventure mode. She only wants to play in creative mode, because she hates the being killed, and I can't blame her. So she just plays creative mode and has just as much fun. And so I think, again, rethinking what a game is and being more inclusive in our thinking. Games don't have to have death always. I mean, some games maybe do, but even games you think they might have to, maybe you can take off that restriction. Who says in Tomb Raider you have to be able to die? Why can't Lara Croft have picnic mode where you're just strolling through the world and enjoying it and with no risk of death at all? Now, that might not be fun for a certain type of traditional player, but it would allow a younger player to experience the game and see more of the world than they might otherwise. So I just think that we should be a little more open in terms of what those experiences can look like.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know that in some games I've seen, instead of truly dying, you get sort of knocked down and one of your NPC teammates comes over and helps you get back up. So there's a little delay. You're like slightly punished for it, but you're not going through a feeling of true loss.
Right. Again, it goes back to, this is the thing from that LiveOps thing I talked about earlier, that notion of, are you a movie director with a story to tell and you're the auteur, and it's all about your vision and you're basically going to tell the story you want whether your players like it or not? Or are you more like the players are sitting with you on the same side of the design table and you're literally designing with them in mind and really trying to figure out what experiences they want? And I'm not saying, one of the things that they often say within Minecraft is like, if you just ask players what they want, they all want toilets in the game. Like, okay, fine, we're not going to put a toilet in the game. Like that's pandering. That's giving players too much what they want, maybe. But that doesn't mean you have to throw the whole idea out. And really trying to figure out what your players want and being willing to give it can open up whole new areas for design that maybe you were limited in your own thinking, but you realize that your players actually really do want, and that can take you down some very fruitful paths.
So if you were to give one summary tip, one nugget of truth for our viewers who are trying to get more into LiveOps, inclusive LiveOps development, what would you tell them?
Just listen to your players. All the answers are there. You just have to have that growth mindset and to be open-minded and not try to put your own lens in front of the data you're getting, but to just really listen to your players.
Great, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, James. This has been really enlightening, and it's been a pleasure to hear about LiveOps and your experience with game design and analytics and everything else that's part of it.
Great, thank you very much.